In the jungles and steep hills of northeast India, in the spring of 1944, a small force of British and Indian soldiers found themselves surrounded on a ridge above a narrow road. For weeks they fought at ranges so close they could hear the enemy talking in the dark. Later, historians would call it the Stalingrad of the East. If Kohima and Imphal had fallen, the road into India lay open. Japan hoped that victory here would shatter British rule on the subcontinent and change the balance of the war in Asia. Instead, these twin battles became the turning point in the Burma campaign and one of the greatest but least known Allied victories of World War II. This is the story of Kohima and Imphal, the battles that stopped a Japanese invasion, saved India, and then quietly slipped out of popular memory. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and struck across Southeast Asia in 1941 and 1942, its armies moved with terrifying speed. Malaya fell, Singapore surrendered, Rangoon was lost, and British forces retreated northwest into India. Burma became a brutal, confused battlefield of jungle, monsoon, and collapsing supply lines. By early 1944, the Japanese 15th Army, under Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, held most of Burma and looked toward India as the next objective. Mutaguchi believed a bold offensive into India could knock Britain out of the war in the east, inspire an uprising against colonial rule, and cut the land route that supplied Chinese forces. The plan was codenamed Operation U-Go. Opposing them was the British 14th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General William Slim. His forces were a mix of British, Indian, and Gurkha units, many of them exhausted from earlier retreats and jungle fighting. They faced impossible terrain, dense jungle, steep ridges, poor roads, and the ever-present threat of the monsoon turning tracks into rivers of mud. Strategically, two places mattered above all: the valley town of Imphal, a major supply base and airfield complex, and the small hill station of Kohima, perched on a ridge overlooking the vital road from Dimapur to Imphal. If Japan could seize Imphal and cut the road at Kohima, the British forces in the region could be isolated and starved into collapse. Mutaguchi ordered 3 Japanese divisions to push through the jungles and mountains toward India. The plan was daring but dangerously optimistic. Supply lines would stretch over narrow tracks and mule paths, with little motor transport. His men would march with limited rations, expected to live off captured British stores around Imphal once victory was achieved. For the Allies, the coming offensive was a serious threat, but also an opportunity. Slim believed that if the Japanese advanced deep into India, they would overextend themselves, just as they had done in earlier campaigns. If his troops could hold key strongpoints like Imphal and Kohima, air supply and superior logistics might finally turn the tide in Burma. As 1944 began, patrols clashed in the jungles along the India-Burma frontier. Rumors of a major Japanese move spread among British and Indian units. Few of the men on the ground could guess that their isolated positions, a valley base at Imphal and a ridge town at Kohima, were about to become the center of one of the decisive land battles of the war in Asia. By March 1944, Operation U-Go moved from planning to reality. In the dense jungles and steep hills along the Burma-India border, 3 Japanese divisions began their advance toward Imphal and Kohima. Columns of infantry wound along narrow tracks, carrying everything they could on their backs or on mules. There were few vehicles, almost no proper roads, and little margin for delay. Japanese commanders promised their men a swift, decisive victory. Once they broke through the frontier and seized Imphal's depots, food and ammunition would be plentiful. Until then, the soldiers marched on short rations, driven by discipline, faith in the emperor, and a belief that the British were weak and would collapse under pressure. Many of them had already fought hard campaigns in China and Burma. They were experienced, tough, and used to hardship. On the Allied side, British and Indian units watched the jungle nervously. Patrols encountered Japanese scouts more frequently. Reports of enemy columns, sometimes exaggerated, filtered back to Army headquarters. Commanders knew a major attack was coming. The question was where the hammer would fall hardest. Imphal, sitting in a valley ringed by hills, was an obvious target. It held airfields, supply dumps, and roads reaching toward the Burma front. Kohima, by contrast, seemed like a small dot on the map, a hill station where the road from Dimapur climbed toward Imphal. But that road was the lifeline. Without it, food, ammunition, and reinforcements could not easily reach the valley. As the Japanese pushed west, they began to bypass or cut off scattered Allied outposts. Some British and Indian units were forced to retreat under pressure, fighting delaying actions to buy time. Others found themselves surrounded and had to break out through the jungle or risk annihilation. Stories spread of sudden night attacks, screaming charges, and positions overrun in the dark. In this chaos, the importance of Imphal and Kohima came sharply into focus. At Imphal, Allied commanders pulled in units and strengthened defensive positions, preparing to be surrounded if necessary. At Kohima, a small garrison and scattered troops along the road were told to hold as long as they could. As March turned to April, the Japanese net tightened. Columns moved to encircle Imphal from multiple directions, while another thrust pushed toward the Dimapur-Imphal road. Radio messages from forward units became more urgent. Supply convoys were ambushed. Air reconnaissance confirmed that large enemy forces were now deep inside Indian territory. Operation Yugo was fully underway. The stage was set for two interconnected battles, a siege in the valley at Imphal and a desperate stand on the ridge at Kohima. Imphal, surrounded by hills, had been transformed into a major base during the Burma retreat. Airfields, supply depots, workshops, and hospitals sprawled across the valley. For the Japanese High Command, capturing Imphal meant seizing vast stockpiles of fuel, food, and ammunition and destroying the heart of the Allied presence in this sector. As Japanese divisions moved in, the roads leading into Imphal grew dangerous. Columns that once drove in and out with relative freedom now faced ambushes and roadblocks. Bridges were blown, tracks were blocked, and patrols reported enemy positions closing in. By late March, it was clear that Imphal was effectively under siege. General Slim and his commanders made a crucial decision. Imphal would not be abandoned. Instead, they would hold the valley, rely on air supply, and wait for the Japanese offensive to exhaust itself. It was a risky strategy. If the airfields were lost or badly damaged, the defenders could be starved into submission. Inside the perimeter, British, Indian, and Gurkha units dug in. Defensive positions ringed the valley, anchored on key hills and ridges. Engineers worked to improve airstrips under the threat of artillery fire and air raids. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned to protect the transport aircraft that had become the lifeline of the garrison. For the soldiers, life during the siege was a mix of waiting and sudden violence. Days might pass with only occasional skirmishes and artillery exchanges, followed by brutal attacks as Japanese units probed the defensive ring. Many assaults came at night, with attackers trying to infiltrate through the jungle and strike from unexpected directions. The heat during the day was intense, and dust coated everything. At night, temperatures dropped and damp air rolled into the valley. As weeks passed, the weather shifted toward the monsoon. Roads became rivers of mud. Foxholes flooded, trenches collapsed and had to be dug again. Disease remained a constant threat. Even when food and ammunition arrived by air, men still had to fight malaria, dysentery, and fatigue. Despite the pressure, air power gave the defenders a growing advantage. Transport aircraft kept flying into Imphal, delivering supplies and taking out the wounded. Fighters and bombers struck Japanese positions and attempted to disrupt their already fragile supply lines. Japanese troops, who had counted on capturing British depots quickly, found their own rations dwindling. Battlefields around Imphal saw fierce clashes on ridges and in jungle clearings. Units fought to hold key hills that dominated stretches of valley. Platoons and companies were reduced in strength by casualties and disease. But positions had to be held. Stories circulated of isolated groups fighting on even when nearly surrounded, relying on airdrops and occasional relief columns. While Imphal fought to endure, a smaller, even more desperate drama began at Kohima. Kohima was a hill station and administrative center sitting astride the single road from Dimapur to Imphal. That twisting road was the main artery feeding the front. If it was cut, reinforcing or resupplying Imphal from India would become far more difficult. The ridge on which Kohima stood rose sharply above the surrounding valleys. On its slopes stood bungalows, administrative buildings, and the district commissioner's house. Terraces, gardens, and a tennis court cut into the hillside created flat spaces on otherwise steep ground. In peacetime, it was quiet. In wartime, it became a fortress. In early April 1944, only a modest garrison defended Kohima. British and Indian troops were scattered around the area, many in improvised positions. As Japanese columns approached, outlying posts reported more and more contacts. It became clear that the enemy intended to seize the ridge and cut the road. By the first week of April, the defenders at Kohima found themselves under growing pressure. Outlying posts were abandoned as Japanese troops appeared in unexpected numbers. The defenders pulled back onto the main ridge, establishing a perimeter around key points: the district commissioner's bungalow, the tennis court, and nearby positions that looked down onto the road. On 4th April, Japanese units launched full-scale attacks against Kohima. Shells began to fall on the ridge. Small arms fire echoed through the hills. The defenders realized they were at the center of a major battle. They were badly outnumbered, but they dug in, turning walls, trees, and terraced gardens into firing positions. The district commissioner's bungalow at Kohima stood near the crest of the ridge, with a flat tennis court cut into the hillside beside it. In peacetime, it had been a symbol of quiet colonial life in a remote hill town. In wartime, it became the focal point of some of the closest and fiercest fighting of the entire campaign. As Japanese units pressed their attack, they captured positions close to the bungalow. The defenders dug trenches on one side of the tennis court. The Japanese held the other. At its narrowest point, only a few yards separated the two lines. The distance was so short that men on each side could hear the other moving, digging, and shouting orders. This small patch of ground turned into a killing zone. Every stump, wall, and depression became cover. Snipers watched for the slightest movement. Artillery and mortars pounded the court and surrounding gardens, tearing up the surface and filling it with craters. At night, Japanese soldiers attempted to infiltrate across the court into British and Indian trenches. The defenders replied with flares, machine gun bursts, grenades, and bayonet charges. Positions changed hands multiple times. Supplies were scarce. Wounded men were treated in makeshift aid posts only meters behind the line. For the attackers, conditions were also grim. They were ordered to take the ridge at all costs, but ran into accurate fire and stubborn resistance. Each new assault cost more lives. Reinforcements gradually reached Kohima from Dimapur. Fresh troops climbed into the ridge positions, taking over from exhausted units. With more men and heavier artillery, the defenders started to push the Japanese back, yard by yard. The tennis court and bungalow area, once on the brink of being overrun, became the starting point for a deliberate Allied advance across the ridge. As April turned to May, Kohima changed from a desperate stand to an offensive. Allied guns pounded Japanese positions. Infantry cleared bunkers and trenches one by one. The initiative shifted. Japanese units, short of food and ammunition, began to show signs of strain. At the same time, the larger offensive that had driven them into India was faltering. Around Imphal, Japanese forces suffered from starvation, disease, and relentless air attack. Their supply lines, stretched over jungle tracks, could not sustain the offensive. Inside the Imphal perimeter, Allied troops, still supplied from the air, began to counterattack and retake key hills. The link between Kohima and Imphal, the twisting road and the surrounding high ground, was slowly restored as Japanese units around Kohima were pushed back and Allied columns fought their way south. As this corridor reopened, the strategic picture changed completely. Instead of isolating Allied forces, Japanese units themselves became isolated. Operation U-Go, conceived as a bold strike to break British power in India, turned into a disastrous retreat through mountains and monsoon. Japanese casualties were enormous, not just from combat but from hunger and disease. Entire units were reduced to fragments. Soldiers collapsed along jungle trails, unable to go further. For the Allies, the outcome was transformative. The twin battles of Imphal and Kohima had stopped the Japanese invasion, inflicted huge losses on veteran units, and shattered the myth that they could not be beaten in the jungle. They secured India from invasion and paved the way for the eventual reconquest of Burma. When the guns finally fell silent, the hills and valleys of northeast India were scarred by months of continuous fighting. Villages had been destroyed, forests shattered, and slopes buried under spent shells and debris. The cost in human life on both sides was immense. In purely military terms, Imphal and Kohima were recognized as a decisive turning point. They safeguarded the Allied position in the region and marked the moment when the initiative in the Burma theater passed decisively to the British and Indian armies. Years later, some historians would describe Imphal-Kohima as Britain's greatest land battle of the war. Yet outside India, Burma, and specialist history circles, these battles remained relatively obscure. Popular memory of the Second World War focused on Normandy, Stalingrad, El Alamein, and the island-hopping campaigns of the Pacific. The ridge at Kohima, the valley at Imphal, and the men who fought there slipped into the shadows. Today, cemeteries and memorials mark the ground they defended and attacked. The story of Kohima and Imphal is one of ambition and miscalculation, endurance and sacrifice, and of how a decisive victory can still become a forgotten chapter of World War II. On a ridge above a narrow road in the hills of India, and in a valley ringed by jungle and mountains, the Allies turned back an invasion that might have changed the map of Asia. The battles of Kohima and Imphal, the Stalingrad of the East, saved India, broke the momentum of the Japanese advance, and set the stage for victory in Burma, even if the world rarely remembers their names. If this episode helped you discover a part of World War II you'd never heard about, consider subscribing to WW2 Lost Records and turning on notifications for more forgotten battles and declassified stories. There are many more hidden campaigns and lost front lines waiting to be uncovered.